What happened when the school counselor was prohibited from calling 911 when a student said they wanted to hurt themselves? I was standing at my office door at 2:17 p.m. when Maya Thornton walked in without knocking and said, "Mr. Brenner, I think I'm going to kill myself tonight." She stood in the doorway of my counseling office at Westfield High School, with her backpack still on, mascara streaked down her face, and her hands shaking so badly she'd crossed her arms to hide it. I'd been a school counselor for 11 years and had handled dozens of suicide risk assessments, and my immediate instinct was to reach for my phone to call 911 while keeping Maya talking. But then I remembered the memo that had arrived in my inbox 3 days ago from our new principal, Dr. Gerald Ashford, titled Updated Crisis Response Protocols. The memo explicitly stated that all emergency service calls, including 911, required administrative approval before being placed to prevent unnecessary disruptions and ensure proper documentation of school crisis situations. I'd read it twice, assuming I'd misunderstood, then forwarded it to the district office asking for clarification. They'd responded within an hour, confirming that the policy was legitimate and aligned with the district's new focus on administrative oversight and liability management. I'd filed the email away thinking it couldn't possibly apply to genuine emergencies. But here was Maya, 16 years old, telling me she planned to end her life, and the policy memo was clear. No 911 calls without administrative approval first. I guided Maya to the chair across from my desk and shut the door, my mind racing through protocols and legal obligations while trying to maintain the calm, present demeanor that crisis intervention required. "Maya, I'm really glad you came to talk to me. That took courage. Tell me what's happening that's making you feel this way." She started crying harder, words tumbling out about her parents' divorce, her father moving to another state, her mother's new boyfriend who made her uncomfortable, and the online bullying that had escalated after she'd turned down a popular senior's invitation to homecoming. She said she'd been cutting herself for 3 months, showed me the scars on her forearms hidden beneath long sleeves, and explained that she'd been researching methods online and had written goodbye letters to her best friend and younger brother. The specificity of her plan, the means she'd identified, the timeline she'd established, everything pointed to imminent high risk. This was exactly the kind of situation where immediate psychiatric evaluation and hospitalization were necessary, where calling 911 was the standard, legally protected response. But Dr. Ashford's policy required administrative approval first, and I knew from previous interactions with him that approval wasn't guaranteed. I needed to assess how immediate the danger was while figuring out how to navigate this impossible situation. "Maya, do you have access to the means you've been researching? Are the materials at home right now?" She nodded and said her mother kept prescription sleeping pills in the bathroom cabinet, enough pills that Maya had counted them and calculated dosages from medical websites. She planned to take them after her mother left for her night shift job at the hospital at 10 p.m. That gave us less than 8 hours, and Maya was sitting in my office telling me her plan with a level of detail that indicated serious intent rather than a cry for help. I asked if she could promise me she wouldn't hurt herself today, a standard safety question, and she looked at me with hollow eyes and said, "I don't want to promise that, because I'll just be lying to you." The honesty was both brave and terrifying. This child needed immediate intervention, needed to be in a psychiatric facility where professionals could keep her safe while addressing the crisis. I reached for my phone to call 911, then remembered the policy again and felt rage building in my chest at the impossible position this put me in. I told Maya I needed to make some calls to get her help, that she wasn't alone and we'd figure this out together, then stepped into the hallway and called Dr. Ashford's office. His secretary, Denise Wu, answered and said he was in a meeting with the athletic boosters discussing the new stadium funding proposal. I explained this was an emergency involving student safety and needed to speak with him immediately. Denise hesitated, then said she'd see if he could step out. I waited on hold for 3 minutes, each second feeling like betrayal of the student sitting in my office who'd trusted me enough to disclose her suicidal intent. Dr. Ashford finally picked up, his voice irritated at the interruption. "This better be genuinely urgent, Kevin. We're discussing a $7 million capital project." I explained in clear professional terms that I had a student in my office, expressing active suicidal ideation with a specific plan and means, that I needed to call 911 for immediate psychiatric evaluation and was requesting his approval per the new protocol. There was a pause, then Dr. Ashford said, "What's the student's name?" I told him Maya Thornton, and I heard him typing on his computer. Junior, 3.2 GPA, no prior disciplinary issues. Has she been evaluated by a mental health professional before? The question felt irrelevant and intrusive, but I answered that her records didn't indicate prior psychiatric treatment. Dr. Ashford made a humming sound, still typing. And you're certain this requires emergency services? Not a parent contact and referral to community mental health resources? I kept my voice level despite wanting to scream. Dr. Ashford, she has a specific plan to overdose on medication tonight when her mother leaves for work. This is imminent risk requiring immediate intervention. Standard protocol is 911 and emergency psychiatric evaluation. Another pause. Kevin, I need you to understand something. Every time we call 911 to campus, it creates documentation that the district considers high risk from a liability perspective. It signals to the community that we can't handle our own crises internally. The new protocol exists specifically to reduce our reliance on external emergency services for situations we can manage ourselves. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This isn't about managing internally. This is about a child who's telling me she plans to kill herself in less than 8 hours. We have a legal and ethical obligation to ensure her immediate safety. Dr. Ashford's voice went cold. We have multiple obligations, Kevin, including to the 2,400 other students whose educational environment is disrupted every time ambulances and police arrive on campus. Here's what I'm authorizing. Contact the student's parent, explain the situation, and recommend they seek immediate evaluation at County Behavioral Health. Document everything thoroughly. But no 911 call. Handle it through appropriate family channels. I stood in the hallway outside my office, phone pressed against my ear, processing the fact that my principal was explicitly prohibiting me from calling emergency services for a suicidal student. Dr. Ashford, if I contact the parent and they can't or won't take her immediately for evaluation, what's the backup plan? His voice was final. Then we schedule a follow-up with you tomorrow and continue monitoring. But we're not calling 911. That's my decision as building principal, and it's within my authority under the new district protocols. Is that clear? I thought about my professional license, about mandatory reporting laws, about the liability I'd personally face if something happened to Maya tonight. It's clear that you're giving that directive. But I need you to understand that I'm documenting this conversation and may need to consult with the district's legal counsel about my obligations here. Dr. Ashford's laugh was humorless. Consult with whoever you want. But you're not calling 911 without my approval, and I'm not giving it. Now I need to get back to my meeting. Handle this appropriately, Kevin. He hung up before I could respond, and I stood there staring at my phone, a student in crisis behind one door, and an administrator who'd just prohibited me from accessing emergency services behind another. I went back into my office where Maya sat hunched in her chair, crying quietly. She looked up when I entered and said, "I heard you on the phone. You're not going to help me, are you?" The defeat in her voice broke something in me. I sat down across from her and said, "Maya, I am absolutely going to help you. What you heard was me dealing with administrative procedures, but that doesn't change the fact that you came here because you needed support and you're going to get it." I pulled out my personal cell phone, not the school line, and said I was calling her mother right now. Maya gave me her mom's number and I dialed, praying that her mother would be available and willing to take immediate action. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I left a message identifying myself as Maya's school counselor and saying it was urgent. She called me back immediately regarding her daughter's safety. I tried her mother's work number, listed in our emergency contacts, and got transferred to the hospital's nursing supervisor, who said Jennifer Thornton was with a patient and couldn't be interrupted except for life-threatening family emergencies. I said this qualified as exactly that, and to please have her call me within 5 minutes. The supervisor said she'd pass along the message. While we waited for the callback, I stayed with Maya, asking her about the goodbye letters she'd written and what she'd said in them. She described writing to her best friend Kayla about how she was sorry for being such a burden and hoped Kayla would understand why she had to do this. She'd written to her 11-year-old brother telling him he was the only good thing in her life, but that she couldn't stay around just for him, that the pain was too big. Listening to her describe these letters, while knowing I'd been prohibited from calling the one resource designed for exactly this situation made me feel complicit in a system actively endangering this child. My phone rang at 2:31 p.m., 14 minutes after Maya had first walked into my office. Jennifer Thornton's voice was stressed and rushed. "Mr. Brenner, what's going on? They pulled me out of a patient room." I explained as clearly and calmly as possible that Maya had disclosed suicidal ideation with a specific plan, and that she needed immediate psychiatric evaluation. There was silence on the other end. Then Jennifer said, "Oh, God. I knew something was wrong. She's been so withdrawn lately. What do I need to do?" I told her the recommendation was to take Maya directly to County Behavioral Health for Crisis Assessment, that they had a walk-in evaluation service. Jennifer said she'd leave work immediately and be at the school in 20 minutes. I felt relief that Maya's mother was responsive and taking action, but 20 minutes felt like a dangerous delay for a student in active crisis. I asked Jennifer if she wanted me to call 911 to have Maya transported immediately for evaluation, making the suggestion carefully to see how she'd respond. Jennifer said, "Is that necessary? I mean, I can be there in 20 minutes and take her myself. I don't want her traumatized by ambulances and police if we can avoid it." I understood the instinct to protect her daughter from additional stress, but explained that professional transport might be safer given the severity of Maya's statements. Jennifer was quiet, then said, "Let me talk to my supervisor about leaving work, and I'll call you back in 2 minutes about whether we need the ambulance." She hung up, and I looked at Maya, who'd heard my side of the conversation. "Your mom's coming to get you. She loves you and wants to make sure you're safe." Maya nodded but didn't look reassured. "She's going to be so mad at me. She already has so much to deal with." I told her that her mother's first reaction would be concern, not anger, and that parents want nothing more than to keep their children safe, even when they don't always show it perfectly. Jennifer called back at 2:34 p.m. and said her supervisor was giving her hell about leaving during shift, that she'd probably get written up, but she was coming anyway. She said she didn't think the ambulance was necessary, that she'd drive Maya to the behavioral health center herself, and could I keep Maya in my office until she arrived? I agreed, which meant I was essentially creating a safety plan without involving emergency services, exactly what Dr. Ashford had directed, but exactly opposite what my training and professional judgment indicated was appropriate. I sat with Maya for the next 17 minutes, talking to her about coping strategies, asking her to identify reasons to stay alive, having her delete the dosage calculation searches from her phone's browser history so the means weren't so easily accessible. At 2:51 p.m., Jennifer Thornton arrived at my office, still wearing her hospital scrubs, her face pale with worry. She immediately hugged Maya and started crying, and I briefed her again on the severity of the situation and the importance of the immediate evaluation. Jennifer promised she'd take Maya directly to the crisis center and call me once they'd been assessed. I watched them leave my office together, Maya leaning against her mother's shoulder, and felt the heavy responsibility of hoping I'd made the right call by following administrative directive instead of emergency protocol. I immediately sat down and documented everything. Time of Maya's arrival, exact quotes of her statements about suicide intent, my call to Dr. Ashford and his explicit prohibition of 911 contact, my conversations with Jennifer Thornton, and the plan for Maya to be taken for professional evaluation by her parent. I printed 3 copies, one for Maya's file, one for my own records, and one that I planned to send to the district's student services director. I also sent an email to Dr. Ashford summarizing what had transpired and noting that I had followed his directive against my professional judgment, but wanted it documented that I had recommended emergency services and been overruled. His response came back within 10 minutes. Noted, this is exactly the kind of situation our new protocols are designed to address more efficiently. Good work handling it through family channels? The email made me want to throw my computer through the window. Good work? I'd been forced to bypass emergency services for a suicidal student because of an administrative policy prioritizing liability over safety. Nothing about this was good work. Jennifer Thornton called me at 4:18 p.m. from the County Behavioral Health Center. She sounded exhausted and said they'd been in the waiting room for over an hour and still hadn't been seen by a crisis evaluator. The center was understaffed and backed up with other emergencies. I asked how Maya was doing, and Jennifer said she seemed calmer but was mostly staring at her phone and not talking. I told Jennifer it was critical they be seen by someone today given the specificity of Maya's plan, and Jennifer said she wasn't leaving until that happened. She asked if I'd be available tomorrow if Maya needed to talk again, and I assured her I would be. After we hung up, I sat at my desk feeling uneasy about the situation, but telling myself that Maya was with her mother, was at a crisis facility, and would be evaluated. I'd followed the directive I'd been given while documenting my disagreement. Professionally, I'd done what I could within the constraints imposed on me. But the unease didn't go away. A persistent feeling that something was terribly wrong with a system that prevented school counselors from accessing emergency resources for students in crisis. I didn't hear anything more that evening, and by the next morning, I was checking my email compulsively for updates from Jennifer Thornton or from the crisis center with a release of information. Nothing arrived. At 8:15 a.m., I sent an email to Jennifer checking on Maya's status and asking her to call me when she had a chance. The email bounced back with an automated response saying Jennifer Thornton's email address was not recognized. I called her cell phone and got voicemail. I called the hospital where she worked and asked to be transferred to her department, and the operator said there was no Jennifer Thornton in that department. I insisted I'd spoken to her there yesterday and had the direct number, and the operator checked again and confirmed no one by that name worked at County General Hospital. Confusion turned to alarm as I realized something was very wrong. I pulled Maya's enrollment file and checked the parent contact information more carefully. The phone numbers I'd called were listed, but when I looked at the employment verification section completed during registration, it listed Jennifer's employer as Mercy Regional Hospital, not County General. I'd called County General yesterday because that's what the nursing supervisor had said when I was transferred, but Maya's file said Mercy Regional. I called Mercy Regional Hospital and asked for Jennifer Thornton in nursing. They transferred me immediately, and a woman answered, "Fourth floor nursing station, this is Jennifer." I identified myself and asked if she was Maya Thornton's mother. There was a pause. "I don't have a daughter named Maya. You must have the wrong Jennifer Thornton." My stomach dropped. "You don't have a daughter at Westfield High School?" She said no, she had 2 sons in elementary school, and asked what this was about. I apologized for the confusion and hung up, my mind racing through implications. I'd spoken to someone yesterday claiming to be Maya's mother, someone who'd known enough details to be convincing, but apparently wasn't actually her parent. I pulled up Maya's emergency contact information again and saw that both parent phone numbers led to the same voicemail boxes I'd reached yesterday. I called the main contact number and got the same voicemail I'd heard before. This time I listened more carefully to the greeting. It was generic, no name stated, just leave a message after the beep. I called the alternate number and got the same recording, same generic greeting. These weren't legitimate parent contacts. Someone had provided fake information during Maya's enrollment. I immediately went to the main office and asked to see Maya Thornton's complete registration file, including the documents her parents had submitted when she enrolled. The registrar, Betty Ashland, pulled up the electronic file and said everything looked in order. Parent names, addresses, phone numbers, all properly documented. But I asked to see the physical copies of identification or utility bills that would have been required to verify residency. Betty accessed the file cabinet where paper documents were stored and pulled Maya's folder. Inside were photocopies of a driver's license for Jennifer Thornton and a utility bill for the address listed in Maya's file. The driver's license photo showed a woman in her 40s with dark hair. I asked Betty if she remembered Maya's mother coming in to register her. Betty thought about it and said the registration had been done last summer and she processed dozens of students each day, so she couldn't recall specifically. I asked if there was any way to verify if the documents were legitimate. Betty looked uncomfortable and said they didn't typically verify beyond checking that documents were provided, that fake registrations were rare and usually involved families trying to access better school districts illegally. I went back to my office and called the police non-emergency line, explaining that I had a student who'd disclosed suicidal ideation, and I'd subsequently discovered her emergency contacts appeared to be fraudulent. The dispatcher asked if the student was currently at school, and I said I didn't know. I hadn't seen her this morning, but didn't have access to attendance records in real time. The dispatcher transferred me to a school resource officer who was assigned to one of the district's elementary schools. Officer Tom Blackwell listened to my explanation and said this was concerning, but asked what specific crime I was reporting. I said I wasn't sure if it was a crime, but a minor had potentially been provided with false identification and contact information by whoever enrolled her in school. Officer Blackwell said he'd file a report and have someone from the juvenile division follow up, but that it might take a day or two to investigate. He asked if I had reason to believe the student was in immediate danger. I explained the suicidal statements from yesterday and the fake parent contact. Officer Blackwell's tone changed immediately. "You're telling me you have a suicidal minor whose parent contacts are fake and you don't know where she is right now?" I confirmed that was exactly what I was telling him. Officer Blackwell said he'd dispatch officers to the address listed in Maya's file immediately and asked me to check if she was in class. I ran to the attendance office, where the secretary showed me the daily attendance report. Maya Thornton was marked absent for first and second period, which had already passed. No parent had called to excuse the absence. Officer Blackwell said he'd call me back after they checked the residence and told me not to approach the address myself. I sat in the attendance office, my hands shaking, realizing that I'd sent a suicidal student home yesterday with someone claiming to be her parent who apparently wasn't, and we had no idea where she actually was or who she was with. The attendance secretary asked if everything was okay, and I said there was a situation being investigated, but couldn't provide details. I went back to my office and pulled up the email I'd sent to Dr. Ashford yesterday, documenting the crisis and his directive not to call 911. I forwarded it to the district superintendent, the director of student services, and the district's legal counsel with a new message. I need immediate guidance on a developing situation involving the student referenced below. Emergency contacts may be fraudulent, and student's current location is unknown. My phone rang at 9:32 a.m. It was Officer Blackwell. "Mr. Brenner, we went to the address on file for Maya Thornton. It's a vacant lot. There's no residence at that location. We're running the name Jennifer Thornton through databases, but without additional information, it's going to be difficult to identify who registered this student or where they are now. Can you describe the woman you spoke to yesterday?" I described my phone conversations, and Officer Blackwell pointed out I'd never seen the woman in person, just spoke to her on the phone. I said that was correct. He asked if I'd seen Maya leave with anyone yesterday, and I confirmed I'd watched them walk out together but didn't see their vehicle or get any other identifying information. Officer Blackwell said they were putting out a missing person alert for Maya Thornton, age 16, but the lack of verifiable information made this extremely difficult. He asked if I had a photo, and I said I could get one from the student ID database. He asked me to email it immediately to the address he provided, and I did, pulling up Maya's ID photo from August, showing a young woman with long brown hair and a tentative smile. The district's director of student services, Rachel Pemberton, called my cell phone at 9:45 a.m. Her voice was tight with controlled panic. "Kevin, I got your email. Walk me through exactly what happened yesterday and what you're telling me today." I explained everything chronologically. Maya's disclosure, my call to Dr. Ashford requesting approval to call 911, his refusal and directive to handle through parent contact, my conversations with someone claiming to be Maya's mother, and this morning's discovery that the contact information was fake. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, then said, "You're telling me Gerald prohibited you from calling 911 for an active suicide risk?" I confirmed that was exactly what happened. Rachel said, "That directly violates district crisis protocols and probably multiple legal mandates. Why didn't you call anyway?" The question stung because I'd been asking myself the same thing all morning. I said I'd documented my disagreement but ultimately followed the directive from my building administrator, assuming he had authority to make that call. Rachel said, "Kevin, you're a mandated reporter and a licensed professional. Administrative directives don't override your legal and ethical obligations. This is a catastrophic failure on multiple levels." Dr. Ashford called my office at 10:03 a.m., his voice sharp. "Kevin, I just got pulled out of a curriculum meeting by the superintendent's office demanding to know why police are investigating a student from our building and why I prohibited you from calling 911 yesterday. What the hell is going on?" I explained calmly what had developed regarding Maya's fake enrollment information and missing status. There was silence. Then Dr. Ashford said, "You're trying to make this my fault. You're the counselor. You're responsible for accurately assessing student risk and managing crises appropriately. If you made an error in judgment about this student's situation, that's on you, not me. The attempt to shift blame was transparent and enraging. I said, Dr. Ashford, I have documented evidence of requesting your approval to call 911 and you explicitly denying it. I followed your directive while documenting my professional disagreement. That's precisely what happened, and I've provided that documentation to the district office. Dr. Ashford's voice went cold. We'll see what the investigation determines. In the meantime, don't speak to anyone else about this situation without legal counsel present. He hung up, and I realized he was already in damage control mode, preparing to defend his decision rather than taking accountability for prohibiting access to emergency services. The police called back at 11:17 a.m. with an update. They'd run the name Maya Thornton through missing persons databases and found a match. A 16-year-old named Maya Thornton had been reported missing from Riverside County, 3 hours south, 8 months ago. The physical description matched our student. Parents were Robert and Jennifer Thornton, legitimate people with legitimate contact information in Riverside County. Officer Blackwell said they were contacting the parents now, and I should expect investigators to want to interview me about my interactions with Maya and whoever had been impersonating her mother. He also said they were treating this as a potential parental abduction case, meaning one parent had taken Maya and enrolled her in a different district under false pretenses to evade the other parent. At 11:34 a.m., my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered, and a man's voice said, "Is this Kevin Brenner, the school counselor?" I confirmed, and he said, "This is Robert Thornton. The police just called me about my daughter. Is she okay? Where is she?" His voice was breaking with emotion, and I felt the weight of having to tell him I didn't know. I explained that Maya had been enrolled at Westfield High for 4 months, that she'd come to me yesterday disclosing suicidal thoughts, and that I'd contacted someone claiming to be her mother who'd taken her from school. Robert Thornton started crying. That was her mother, my ex-wife. She has psychiatric issues and lost custody 8 months ago after she tried to overdose with Maya in the house. A judge granted me full custody, and Jennifer had supervised visitation only, but she took Maya during a visit and disappeared. We've been looking for her for 8 months. The police said Maya might be suicidal. I confirmed what Maya had disclosed to me, and Robert said, Jennifer's been filling her head with lies, probably telling her I don't want her, or that the divorce is her fault. Maya was doing okay before Jennifer took her. She was in therapy, grades were improving. Now who knows what state she's in? I told Robert I was deeply sorry, that I'd had no idea about the custody situation, or that Maya's enrollment was fraudulent. He said, You couldn't have known. Jennifer's manipulative. She probably coached Maya on what to say, forged all the documents. What I need to know is where my daughter is right now. That was the question everyone needed answered, and no one could. Police were searching for Jennifer Thornton's vehicle, a 2015 silver Nissan Altima registered in Riverside County, but had no leads on its current location. They'd put out an Amber Alert within the hour, and Robert was driving up from Riverside immediately. I asked if Jennifer had mental health issues that might make her dangerous to Maya, and Robert's voice cracked. Jennifer's bipolar and has borderline personality disorder. When she's off her medication, she becomes paranoid and erratic. She's convinced that I'm trying to turn Maya against her and that the court system is corrupt. 8 months ago, she tried to kill herself by taking pills while Maya was sleeping in the next room. Maya found her unconscious and called 911. That's what led to the custody change. If Jennifer's telling Maya they should die together, if she's creating a suicide pact scenario, then Maya's in immediate danger. The scenario Robert described aligned horrifyingly with what Maya had disclosed to me. A plan to overdose on her mother's prescription medication while the mother was at work. Except Jennifer didn't have a work shift. She'd been home with Maya the whole time, and the suicide plan might have been intended for both of them. The police detective assigned to the case, Linda Kovach, called me at 1:15 p.m. and asked me to come to the station to provide a formal statement. I drove there immediately, my mind replaying every interaction with Maya and trying to identify warning signs I'd missed. Detective Kovach was in her 40s with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested she'd seen too much of humanity's worst. She recorded my statement about Maya's disclosure, my attempts to follow school protocol, Dr. Ashford's prohibition of the 911 call, and my interactions with the person I'd believed was Maya's mother. When I finished, Detective Kovacs sat back and said, "So let me make sure I understand. A student tells you she's planning suicide tonight. You request permission to call 911. Your principal says no. You call the fake mother instead, who says she'll take the student for evaluation but actually disappears with her. And now we have a missing teenager who might be part of a murder-suicide situation with her mentally ill mother." The summary was accurate and devastating. I confirmed it was correct, and Detective Kovacs said, "That principal's decision may have cost us the window to safely locate this girl. If something happens to her, he's got significant legal exposure." Detective Kovacs asked if I'd be willing to testify about Dr. Ashford's directive if the case went to criminal or civil proceedings. I said absolutely, that I documented everything precisely because I knew it was wrong. She nodded and said she'd be interviewing Dr. Ashford next, and that the district was already retaining legal counsel. She asked if I knew why Dr. Ashford had implemented the policy prohibiting 911 calls without administrative approval. I explained that his stated rationale was reducing liability and preventing unnecessary disruptions, but that the policy directly contradicted standard crisis intervention protocols and probably multiple legal mandates regarding duty to warn and mandatory reporting. Detective Kovacs made notes and said this would all be part of the investigation into how a missing teenager under abduction alert had been allowed to leave school custody with someone impersonating her guardian. I asked if there was anything I could do to help find Maya, and Detective Kovacs said the best thing I could do was be available for further questions and provide any documentation that might help establish Jennifer Thornton's mental state or intentions. The Amber Alert went public at 2 p.m., showing Maya's photo and description, along with information about Jennifer Thornton's vehicle and a hotline for tips. The alert specified that Maya was believed to be with her non-custodial mother who had psychiatric issues, and that both could be at risk. My phone started ringing within minutes from reporters who'd somehow gotten my contact information and wanted statements about the case. I referred them all to the police department and the school district's communications office. At 3:30 p.m., I got a call from the district's legal counsel, an attorney named Gregory Fine, who said he was representing the district in this matter and needed to understand my role in the events. I explained everything again, and Gregory said, "Did you, at any point, consider calling 911 anyway, despite Dr. Ashford's directive?" I said I'd considered it, but ultimately followed the administrative chain of command while documenting my disagreement. Gregory was quiet, then said, "That documentation is going to be crucial. The district's position is that Dr. Ashford exceeded his authority and that his directive was inconsistent with district policy and legal requirements. We'll be cooperating fully with law enforcement and conducting our own internal investigation." The news broke on local television at 5 p.m. I watched from my living room as reporters stood outside Westfield High School explaining that a missing teenager had been enrolled under false pretenses for months, that she'd disclosed suicidal intentions to a school counselor the previous day, and that the school had failed to call emergency services before she disappeared with her fugitive mother. The coverage included statements from police about the active search and from the school district saying they were conducting a thorough review of what happened. My name wasn't mentioned specifically, but Dr. Ashford was identified as the principal who'd allegedly prohibited the 911 call. The comments on the news station's social media were brutal, calling for his firing and expressing outrage that a suicidal teenager had been prevented from accessing emergency help. My own phone was flooded with messages from colleagues and friends asking if I was okay and what had really happened. I didn't respond to any of them, just sat watching the news coverage and praying that Maya would be found alive. At 7:43 p.m., my phone rang with a call from Detective Kovacs. "Mr. Brenner, we found them. Maya and Jennifer Thornton were located at a motel about 50 miles north of your district. Both are alive, but Jennifer had apparently given Maya a significant amount of sedative medication. Maya's being transported to the hospital for evaluation and treatment. Jennifer's in custody facing multiple charges including parental abduction, child endangerment, and administering drugs to a minor." The relief that washed over me was overwhelming, but Detective Kovacs continued. "Maya told responding officers that her mother had given her pills yesterday evening and this morning, telling her they were anxiety medication but they were actually heavy sedatives. Jennifer's plan appears to have been to sedate Maya so she couldn't resist and then complete a murder-suicide. A motel employee noticed Jennifer bringing in containers of charcoal and got suspicious, which is what led to the 911 call that resulted in police response. You should know that Maya asked for you specifically, said you were the only person at school she'd trusted. The information was both heartbreaking and validating, knowing Maya had trusted me, but that the system I worked within had failed her catastrophically. The next week brought a cascade of investigations and consequences. The state's Child Protective Services launched a formal review of how a child under abduction alert had been enrolled in a school district for 4 months without detection. The investigation revealed that registration protocols were minimal, that staff weren't trained to identify fraudulent documents, and that background checks weren't conducted on enrolling parents. Dr. Ashford was placed on administrative leave pending the district's internal investigation into his decision to prohibit the 911 call. The teachers' union filed a grievance on my behalf, arguing that I'd been placed in an untenable position by administrative directive that violated professional standards. Robert Thornton filed a lawsuit against the school district for negligence and failure to protect his daughter, and his attorney subpoenaed all documentation related to Maya's enrollment and the crisis response. Jennifer Thornton was charged with parental abduction, child endangerment, attempted murder, and multiple drug-related offenses. Her bail was set at $500,000, and she remained in custody awaiting psychiatric evaluation to determine competency to stand trial. Maya spent 5 days in the hospital undergoing medical treatment for the sedative overdose and psychiatric evaluation for the trauma and suicidal ideation. Robert stayed with her throughout, and I visited twice with permission from both Maya and her father. The second visit. Maya thanked me for trying to help her and apologized for lying about her situation. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, that she'd been manipulated by her mother and placed in an impossible situation. She said her mother had convinced her that Robert didn't want her anymore after the divorce, that going back to him would mean foster care and separation from her younger brother, who Jennifer claimed was staying with relatives, but who was actually safe with Robert the entire time. The layers of manipulation Jennifer had employed were sophisticated and cruel, designed to make Maya feel she had no options except staying with her mother. Maya said the suicide plan had been presented to her as their only option to avoid being separated, and that she'd believed it because she'd been isolated from everyone else who might have told her the truth. The district's internal investigation concluded that Dr. Ashford had violated multiple policies and legal requirements by prohibiting emergency services contact for a student in crisis. The investigative report, which was leaked to local media, found that Dr. Ashford had implemented his new crisis protocol without proper approval from district administration, that the protocol was inconsistent with state mandates regarding mandatory reporting and duty to warn, and that his decision to deny my request to call 911 constituted gross negligence and dereliction of duty resulting in foreseeable harm to a student. The report recommended termination and referral to the state's Education Licensing Board for review of his administrative credentials. Dr. Ashford hired an attorney and fought the termination, arguing he'd been trying to implement cost-saving measures and improve efficiency, that he couldn't have known Maya's situation was fraudulent, and that I should have exercised independent professional judgment regardless of his directive. The argument was both legally weak and morally bankrupt, attempting to blame me for following the directive he'd explicitly given. The school board held a public meeting in November to discuss the findings and determine Dr. Ashford's employment status. The meeting room was packed with community members, many wearing shirts saying, "Protect our students," and carrying signs demanding accountability. Robert Thornton spoke during public comment, describing what Maya had endured and how the school's failure to call 911 had allowed Jennifer additional time to drug and attempt to murder their daughter. Teachers spoke about feeling constrained by administrative policies that prioritized cost savings over student safety. Parents demanded to know what changes were being implemented to prevent similar failures. When Dr. Ashford's attorney spoke, attempting to defend his actions as reasonable administrative oversight, the crowd's anger was palpable. The school board voted unanimously to terminate Dr. Ashford's employment effective immediately and to implement comprehensive policy reforms regarding crisis response, enrollment verification, and administrative authority over emergency services access. The state licensing board held its own hearing about Dr. Ashford's administrative credential in December. I testified about his directive and the impact it had on my ability to provide appropriate crisis intervention. The board found that Dr. Ashford had engaged in conduct unbecoming an educational administrator and suspended his license for 3 years, effectively ending his career in school leadership. He attempted to appeal, but the decision was upheld, with the appeals board noting that his prohibition of emergency services for a suicidal student represented exactly the kind of judgment failure that licensing oversight existed to prevent. The lawsuit filed by Robert Thornton was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, with the district admitting no wrongdoing but agreeing to implement all recommended policy changes and provide funding for Maya's ongoing therapeutic needs. Jennifer Thornton was found competent to stand trial and pleaded guilty to parental abduction and child endangerment in exchange for prosecutors dropping the attempted murder charge. She was sentenced to 8 years in state prison and permanent termination of parental rights. Maya returned to her home district in Riverside County, re-enrolled in school with proper therapeutic supports, and began the slow process of healing from the trauma her mother had inflicted. Robert sent me updates periodically, saying Maya was doing better, that her suicidal ideation had resolved with proper treatment, and that she'd told her therapist I'd been the only adult at Westfield who'd tried to help her. The validation mattered, but it didn't erase the guilt I felt about not calling 911 anyway, about prioritizing administrative compliance over professional judgment, about the hours Maya had spent drugged and preparing to die because I'd followed a directive I knew was wrong. The teachers' union supported me throughout, making clear I'd been placed in an untenable situation, but I still questioned every decision I'd made that day and wondered if I could have done something differently that would have resulted in Maya's immediate safety. The district implemented sweeping reforms in the aftermath. All crisis response protocols were revised to explicitly state that licensed professionals had independent authority to contact emergency services for students at imminent risk, regardless of administrative approval. Enrollment procedures were overhauled to include background verification and cross-referencing with missing persons databases. Staff received comprehensive training on recognizing and responding to custody disputes and parental abduction scenarios. The superintendent issued a public apology to Maya and her family, acknowledging the district's failures and committing to ensuring no student would ever again be prevented from accessing emergency mental health services. The reforms were meaningful and necessary, but they'd come too late for Maya and had required near tragedy to force institutional change. I continued working as a school counselor at Westfield, but the experience fundamentally changed how I approached crisis situations and administrative directives. I joined the State School Counselors Association's Ethics Committee and helped develop guidelines for handling conflicts between administrative demands and professional obligations. I spoke at conferences about the case, using it as an example of how institutional priorities could dangerously supersede student welfare if professionals didn't maintain clear ethical boundaries. I also became an advocate for legislative changes, requiring schools to maintain direct access to emergency services without administrative gatekeeping, testifying before the state legislature about why such access was critical. The legislation passed unanimously, establishing clear legal protections for school staff who contacted emergency services for students at risk and prohibiting administrators from implementing policies that restricted such access. 5 years later, Maya graduated from high school with honors and was accepted to college on a scholarship studying psychology, planning to become a counselor herself to help other teenagers in crisis. She sent me an invitation to her graduation, and I attended, sitting with Robert and watching her walk across the stage. Afterward, she hugged me and said the day I'd tried to help her, even when the system prevented me from doing what was right, had shown her that some adults could be trusted, and that advocacy mattered even when it didn't succeed immediately. She said she wanted to be that person for other kids who felt alone and afraid, to create the kind of support system that had eventually saved her life. Dr. Ashford never worked in education again. Last I heard, he was in sales, and the story of what happened at Westfield became a cautionary tale in administrator training programs about the deadly consequences of prioritizing institutional concerns over student safety. I still think about that day in my office when Maya told me she planned to kill herself, and I reached for the phone only to be stopped by a policy that valued liability management over a child's life. I think about the hours she spent drugged and terrified while I thought she was safe at a crisis center. and I think about how close we came to a completely different ending. One where I'd be living with the knowledge that a student had died because I'd followed an order I knew was wrong. Justice came eventually through investigations, terminations, policy reforms, and legislation, but it came after Maya had already suffered harm that could have been prevented. That's the reality of institutional accountability. It's reactive rather than proactive, learning from failures rather than preventing them, and that truth is both necessary to acknowledge and impossible to fully accept. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.